All right, I'm sure we've got a few more people coming in, but it is after 3 o'clock, so we can go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody for today. For those who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Willis, and I am the project coordinator for the Maryland and DC DeafBlind project. And today we're going to be talking about language and communication for deaf and hard of hearing students, some with additional needs, and or students who are deafblind. I had the chat box open. Let me see if I can, there we go. I will try and monitor the chat box at the same time. So feel free to add stuff to the chat box. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions as well, but we can chat throughout. So I titled this "Language is Not Cute." And that actually, a friend of mine actually came up with that term as we were kind of discussing the complexities of American Sign Language and students who are multimodal, who may have some complex needs, are students who may not have initial access to ASL, or who have a hearing loss that's kind of uncertain of where they fit in their access to spoken language. So I say language is not cute for some of these reasons that we have here. It's not always acquired naturally. Some students might have visual or auditory access impacted, right? So if they might have a moderate to severe hearing loss, a mild to moderate hearing loss, they might have some access to spoken language, so that can give the impression that the student has significant access to language, when really, they might only have access to bits and pieces, or they might have access to sound, but not access to spoken language. Visual-wise, if we're looking at a child who is using visual language, they may not have complete visual access. Could be ocular, might have field losses, it could be processing, like cortical visual impairment, or as we call it, CVI. Students who have late exposure to language. We know that there is a kind of, a more critical period in those first early years where language exposure leads to language acquisition in a more natural format. When that late exposure happens to language, then the ability for it to set up in the brain in the same process can be impacted, and ability to achieve that natural fluency in language can be impacted. There can be an incomplete message across multiple modalities. Sometimes if we're giving kids a little bit of sign, a little bit of spoken language, a little bit of an AAC device, it might be an incomplete message depending on what they're getting from each modality. Our students with multiple disabilities, sometimes when children have complex medical needs, or just have very complex multiple disabilities, sometimes in those early years, deafness may not be seen as the primary concern. The family is dealing with a whole lot of things at one time. The child could be hospitalized for a long time. When they come home, they might be dealing with just simply being able to care for their child and keep them alive. And when you've got tons and tons of services coming in, service providers, infant toddler programs, sometimes that deafness might not be seen as the primary concern in how to support the child's development. So language opportunities, language access may be delayed. For children when English is not the language spoken in the home, for those students who are deaf and hard of hearing, coming from multilingual homes, or homes where English is not spoken at all, those children are struggling to get access. When we enter a school system, they might be getting a spoken language that's different from what they get at home. They might be now accessing sign language as well. So that can be also a struggle for families to learn ASL when it doesn't necessarily follow along the same grammatical structure as their native language. So lots of challenges there. We sometimes take for granted that a given message is a message received, right? So we take for granted sometimes as teachers, as educators, as adults, as parents, as anything working with children, that we have told a child something, we have signed something to them, we have given them a message, but do we actually know that that message was received? Do we know that that student was able to hear that, see that, and comprehend that? So that's really something to think about when we provide information to students, when we're teaching, when we're interacting, when we're simply communicating with our students. Was the message that we gave them, was the direction that we gave them, was there, is that behavior that they have a result of the fact that they did not receive the message that we gave them? Was it actually received? There is an order to acquiring language, no matter what age you start, right? Receptive language happens before expressive language. So taking into consideration some of our students who enter school at 3, 4, 5 years old and might not have had access to sign language prior to that time. When we start exposing them to language, when we start teaching them and finally giving them access to a modality that they can take in that is accessible to them, we have to think about how much time it takes for a typically developing infant to have exposure to language before they ever give anything out expressively. And the order in which that they acquire language, those first words, and how much it takes. And so really, it's not about how many signs we know or how many big words we can use when we're teaching language to children or to adults, but really about making sure that that message that we give is received. I was with a family during a visit with their infant and toddler program the other day, and this was a new parent with a brand new baby who was working on learning some signs, and she was able to give out an entire message to the deaf teacher that she was working with. And I praised her on how well that went, and she was like, yeah, but it was really slow. So she really was not proud of what she had done. And I told her, it doesn't matter how slow it was. Your message that you gave to that teacher was received. You had a conversation, you understood each other, and you shared language. That's what's important, not how fast it went, not how many words you used, not the vocabulary, that you were able to share a message with somebody else. So just thinking of that when we communicate with our students, that sometimes ASL, and those of us who learn ASL as hearing people want to sometimes come out and go, look how much I know, look how fluent I am, look how fast I can sign. But if the message that we give out is not able to be received, if it's not clear, then was it worth that? So this is an interesting quote that I found, because I've also been doing some research lately on psychological assessments for deaf and hard of hearing and deaf-blind students. And so I've been doing some light reading in a book called Language Deprivation and Deaf Mental Health. And it's by two authors, Neil Glickman and Wyatt Hall. And so Wyatt Hall is actually going to be doing a presentation coming up in a couple weeks for ASDC. So if any of you all are interested, he is a deaf man who is very well educated on language development and language deprivation. And so you might want to check that out from ASDC. But he wrote this quote, which if I can move my box, I can see it, that if normal development is like walking a wide path where there is ample room to fall, scrape one's knee, and get back up, then development without effortless language acquisition is like walking a tightrope without a safety net. So that's pretty impactful when we look at our students and how much effort that they have to put into simply accessing information before we even get to learning new concepts, learning new vocabulary, learning to apply what they learn, learning to answer our questions that we ask. So just something to think about. Another great quote is communication versus language. And so this is from Barbara Miles, who is well known in working with students with deaf blindness, in talking about the difference between communication and language. And so she says that, what do we mean by communication? Our first response may be that communication is the use of words in formal language structure, but it's not, it's more, much, much more. It's the means by which people connect with their environment and with other people. Communication is the way we reach out to each other. It's the way we touch each other. So that's really impactful, right? Think about that. Through communication, we connect in the most meaningful sense of the word. Communication is connection. So if we think about that when we're approaching our students with deaf blindness, our students with additional needs, our complex communicators, it's the way we touch each other. It's the way that we connect with people in the most meaningful sense of the word. So that does not have to happen through spoken words, through signs, through print. That can be through a variety of different means in just sharing a message with somebody else. So here's a quick little video of a student who is a pre-emerging communicator, a pre-symbolic communicator. And so just wanted you guys to have a chance to see her interaction with this trusted adult she's with.
We're gonna stand up. That's blocked.
So guess what? Just wanted you guys to be able to see in that video the way that that adult uses touch to communicate with the child. So there are very little words spoken. There are not any signs used. And this child, as you can see, probably appears to initially be in a little bit of distress by the situation, by the activity, about what's going to happen. But this trusted adult uses her body language, her wait time, her patience to give that child the time that they need to process what's happening, to allow them to control the activity or the interaction. So you can see that the child's able to, she puts her hand out, and if it's still too much, she's able to withdraw her hand back because she's not ready yet. And then when she's ready, she's able to come back because that adult is still there. She's just waiting. She's in that same position. She's available. She's an active listener for the student. And then when the child's ready, they're able to proceed. So just looking at some of the different ways that we can communicate with our students, be active listeners and engage with them, just by using our own bodies, our own touch, and that wait time. So some things to remember. All children communicate, right? Every child communicates. But sometimes it's up to the adults to possibly need to interpret the mode, meaning how they're communicating with us, and the function of the message. What is this child potentially trying to say? And there are times that it's something that happened at home or started from home or with somebody else that we might not know. So that's why when we're working with our students who are complex communicators, having interaction between team members about what happens during sessions, having interactions with the adults, parents, keeping those open lines of communication to discuss what something might mean helps that child to have communication across environments and across people. But it sometimes might be us to interpret what that child is trying to express. And as we know, behavior is communication, right? Sometimes it's not. I did read something recently that somebody was saying how behavior sometimes is just behavior. Kids have spontaneous movements. It might not be intended to communicate anything, but primarily, a lot of times, behavior that we witness in our students is communicating something, either intentionally or unintentionally, about just maybe how internally they're regulating or feeling that day or what's going on. So being aware of that. And individuals might receive and express information in different modalities, which could be all the time. Some of our students might receptively need access to spoken English and expressively be signers. Might receptively be using spoken English or ASL and expressively using a speech generating device or some other AAC. It might be at different times of the day that they use multiple modalities based on fatigue. For some of our students with CVI, we know that in the morning, they might be really good and have visual capabilities and be accessing ASL. But by the end of the day, that visual system might be significantly fatigued, and they might need to have more spoken English support or a different modality for receptive information or expressive information or both. So could be changing from moment to moment based on familiarity with vocabulary. For some of our students who are multilingual, coming from maybe multilingual homes or multilingual environments, they might be choosing words based on just, you might be getting a Spanish word for this and an English word for that and a sign for something else. I have seen it where word retrieval from our kids sometimes happens in multiple languages. They're giving you a spoken word for something or spoken words in certain contexts and situations because they have that vocabulary. They're giving you signs at other times because they have that vocabulary in that modality. It can change based on their motor planning, right? If one modality is more difficult for them to use, they might be giving you a few signs and then be using AAC for more expanded communication. So it can totally vary. And we need to provide our students with the opportunities for those multiple modalities, right? So that the goal is their ability to communicate and express in the most competent way possible. Expressive capabilities are not always a measure of receptive understanding. So sometimes our students who might have motor challenges, other things impacted vision, vision loss, whatever is going on, that our students are not as expressive. They might be complex communicators. They're not really giving us a lot out expressively in any modality. Does not necessarily mean that that is a measure of their receptive understanding, as long as we are certain that the information that we are presenting to them is clear, consistent, and accessible. Which goes back to those, initial things that we talked about are we providing them with an accessible information that's accessible to them? Is that message able to be received? If it is, then we need to, judge that maybe not limit our awareness of their capabilities, presume competence, and not use their expressive capabilities as a means of assessing that. So along the same lines of what we've been talking about, this was a pretty interesting poster from a woman named Jane Corsten. You can easily Google this poster and find this online. But it says that by 18 months, babies have heard 4,380 hours of spoken language. and we don't expect them to be fluent speakers yet. If AAC learners only see symbols modeled for communication twice weekly for 20 or 30 minutes, it will take 84 years for them to have the same exposure to aided language as an 18-month-old has to spoken language. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind the next time that you hear that, well, a student's not signing. We're not signing with a student because that student's not signing. Or we're not using this certain modality with a student because that student's not expressing in that modality. It goes back to that thing that we talk about that language there's a process to acquiring language no matter when you start. So have we truly given our students the opportunity for exposure for the duration that's necessary for them to become expressive in the same amount that a typically developing infant has in accessing spoken language from birth? So overall, our goal is not just language development, but rather a shared understanding. It's I love this sign. I get it, you get it. It's that shared message, that shared understanding. It's kind of what we always go back to. And so what do we mean by that? Like we talked about, the ability to physically receive and understand an intended message. So in thinking, how do we make sure we're doing that? Is the modality accessible? Does the student have the auditory or visual or tactile capabilities to receive a message in that modality? And that's on us as adults to know, what does our students' audiogram look like? What is their visual diagnosis? And going back and understanding what that means. If we are not a teacher of the deaf and when you receive a student who has a hearing loss and comes with an audiogram and they talk about the degree or the level, if that's not information that you're familiar with, going and researching, what does that mean in regards to the student's access to sound in general and then to spoken language? In regards to their visual capabilities, is it just presenting it in a different field? Is it presenting it at a certain distance? Or is it their difficulty to process visual language is going to impact how we present information? Is the student demonstrating attention to the communication partner? And so what do we mean by demonstrating attention? For some of our kids, that's hard to tweak out. Are they really attending to us? And we look at things like, visually attending to a speaker, but for some of our students might not have great visual access or be able to give visual attention. So thinking about maybe a calm body, turn towards them, maybe maintaining a contact with a person. If they're in physical contact with that person, receptive to tactile ASL, or even to whatever modality they're getting. Having that physical touch sometimes could be providing attention, responding to spoken language. And you'll see some of the ones on the right that are possible inattention, right? If our kids are self-stimulating, if they're exhibiting behaviors, if they're actively engaged in a task. There's always the saying with kids who have typical hearing level, oh, they heard me, they're just ignoring me. They heard me, they're just not paying attention. Well, did they actually hear? Or still, if they are ignoring, either way, you don't have their attention to whatever you're trying to get them to express to them, to share the message with them. So making sure that we have their attention. And so Christy says in the chat box, could possible self-stimulation help with attention as well? So that's individual to the student, right? For some of our kids, they need to self-stim or do certain things with their body to help regulate themselves in order to attend. You are correct. Some students, and so we will see that And that takes a balance, because sometimes that self-stimulation is them doing something because which shows us that they're not able to attend because they are trying to fulfill their own body's needs. And so it's up to us as adults to try and determine if we can find a way to meet their body's needs in order for them to help be better able to attend to the task. But you will also see students do certain things in order to help their attention. And it might not necessarily be self-stimulation, but it might be their positioning that they put themselves in. It could be that, the way they angle their body so that they have their best visual access. One of the things, David Brown, who is a well-known person in the deaf-blind world, and specifically for children with Charge syndrome, those students have a lot of issues sometimes with maintaining their balance, maintaining their place in space. His big thing that he always says is, we fix the body to fix the head to fix the eyes. And actually by that, we kind of mean we set the way that we set up. So like we set up the body, meaning possibly for a lot of times kids, that's maybe on their back or in some sort of fully supported situation, to be able to fix our head so that our head is not all somewhere in space, but is stable, to be able to stabilize their eyes and their vision and use their vision. So yes, in some ways, stimulation, kids can stimulate themselves in certain ways in order to help them better attend. That's a good point, Christy. Thank you. Does the student understand what they're being asked to do, right? So we use signs for a lot of purposes. Let's take signs as an example. And for our emerging communicators, our students who are just learning some basic signs, simply, we often start right with the sign for more. More comes out a lot. It's a quick one. It has a lot of purposes. But so when we use the sign for more, does the student know, are we using it as, say, a question, a direction? Do you want more? Which in ASL can happen without the use of any other signs. That question can happen simply by our facial expression and the change in our eyebrows. Is, do you want more? We can change that from a statement to a question without any other signs. But if our students have some visual limitations, are they going to be able to catch those little tiny nuances for the difference that we're making this a question of, do you want more? Versus, are we just providing them with information? Are we labeling for them, oh, more, oh, you want more, or you have more? Or are we using it as a prompt, as a model, because we see what they're doing, that they've ran out of food, and so we're simply prompting them because we want them to sign more as an expressive response. Does the student understand in each of those situations why this sign is being used, what it's for, what it means, what the purpose is? So thinking about that when we start to exposing them to language, we use it for lots of different purposes, but does the student actually understand what they're being asked to do in that moment? Or if we add expanded vocabulary, now we're telling them things of like, I need you to sign more, or whatever it might be. Do they understand the other words that we are then adding to them? They might have the more, but do they have the other vocabulary that allows us to explain to them what we're actually asking them to do? And does the student have prior experience with the materials, the activity, the vocabulary being used? We know that all of that prior experience is huge for all learning. So what do they have to bring to the table in the moment that we're in? If the student has a lot of prior experience with the vocabulary, with the routine, with what we're doing, they're going to be able to be a lot more engaged and maybe expand upon what they already have. But if this is all brand new, or we're using new vocabulary, if it's in an environment that's new to them as well, You know, lots of things can complicate that situation and make us have to kind of narrow down our focus of what is our goal in this situation and what can we give this student to actually make it meaningful and have them learn, hopefully, the vocabulary that we are trying to give them from that. So, quick question for everybody is, how do you know your student is actually engaged? And that's just something for everybody to keep in the back of their minds, is how do you know your student is actively engaged in the activity, in what you're doing with them? And so I have a short little video for you guys of a student who is working with an adult. And you will see that, so this is a child who has cochlear implants, but does not get much access to spoken language through them. And she also has cortical visual impairment, so has difficulties processing visual language. She is a student who needs tactile ASL to really, for receptive language. But so we'll keep that in mind. So I don't know if you guys could get from that, but can I get back to the PowerPoint? There we go. What I was hoping that you guys were able to see from that is the difference between how that child appeared to actively engage when there was touch included, when she was using hand under hand and they were coactively signing, versus when some information was presented visually. Right? Doesn't mean that it's wrong, doesn't mean that the student didn't get it, but given this child's visual processing needs, she seemed very visually engaged in the item that she had, in the thing that she was playing with and working with, while the adult was providing her with information about, we're going to do this and then take a break. For this child, that didn't really necessarily need to matter in the moment, but if this is a student, say, who had some significant behaviors where knowing that that break is coming is critical to them being able to maintain through this activity, if that information had been missed, that might have really impacted the situation, right? Because the adult provided that message, they gave that message to the child, but was it actually received? Do we know that they were actively engaged in that moment, or were they possibly engaged with their intention on something else? So just thinking about that when you're working with your students, how do you know they are actively in the moment with you and actively engaged in the conversation that you're having and the message you're trying to send to them? So our deaf and hard of hearing students might be learning receptive language at the same time. At the same time that we are trying to teach grade level concepts and have them answering questions and reading grade level stories, you know, whatever it might be, realizing that our deaf and hard of hearing students might be just having an opportunity to learn receptive language at the same time that we are asking them to do all of this cognitive, conceptual, age-appropriate work. So when we're writing goals for students or determining what tasks and activities they're going to participate in a lesson, keeping in the back of your mind that that student might also be learning at the same time what they're being asked to do. They might be learning simple labels for the objects, actions, people, places, all of the things that we want them to discuss, to answer questions about setting, about characters in a story, all of those things. Does that child even have the vocabulary for that? Do they have the receptive vocabulary of what a character is? You know, people, of who people are, of, you know, what a place is. what kinds of places there are, simple objects in their environment. Do they have a label for them, but either receptively or expressively? The child might be learning simply to attend to a visual or tactile modality. They might simply be learning to look for information that is presented to them either through signs or through tactile ASL. They might be learning, and we're going to talk a little bit about core vocabulary, because a lot of times our core vocabulary are often some very abstract terms, which they might not have had that receptive access to. So this was just something a little funny way to think about kind of what we're talking about today, and misinterpretation. That apparently this one student thought that he heard the word cat instead of bat. And so how often in spoken language do we have words that sound the same but have very different meanings? It's easy, I'm sure, as hearing people, we all know, I'm sure, many situations, funny, embarrassing, whatever it might be, where you thought you heard one thing and you heard something different, right? So even keeping in mind, even a mild hearing loss for a child can have sometimes a significant impact on their receptive understanding of language or receiving language, given whatever, especially in those early developing years when students are just learning to, building that bank of language. For those of us as adults, we have that bank of language already in our brains. So we know that if, we hear something that we think we heard, but it doesn't make any sense to us, we have that bank of language to go, that didn't sound right. Like that's what I thought I heard, but that doesn't make any sense to me. So they must have said this, because this word that sounds alike but is different actually fits in this situation. We have that bank of vocabulary. For our children that are just learning language and are building that bank of vocabulary, if they don't hear things accurately, then that's not going to help them to build. They're not going to be able to make those modifications in the moment to fit the appropriate word in there. So this was something really interesting that that I took from, if anybody's interested, we have another webinar linked to our website from Maurice Belote, B-E-L-O-T-E, who was from the California DeafBlind Project, did a presentation on auditory processing. And he mentioned this about the central auditory system limitations and the fact that a lot of us talk faster than children's brains can actually process. Because at around the 3 to 5 age range, children's brains can only process 120 to 124 words a minute, right? Which is really, really slow. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. But so most adults, as you'll see, typically speak between 160 to 180 words per minute, and many can reach 190. And I'm somebody who is way guilty of talking too fast. I'm working very hard at the moment to try and actually talk very slowly at a decent pace, because the world moves fast. We all move fast, and a lot of us talk very fast. But we might actually be talking faster than our students' brains can literally process. And that's if they have a normal hearing level. So if you all are interested, 120 words per minute, a decent example of that is actually Mr. Rogers. And so I'm hoping that we don't have anybody on here who is too young to remember who Mr. Rogers is or was. But if we do, I have a little clip of him. So this is Mr. Rogers at 120 words per minute.
So many people have helped me to come to this night. Some of you are here, some are far away, some are even in heaven. All of us have special ones who have loved us into being. Would you just take, along with me, 10 seconds to think of the people who have helped you become who you are? Those who have cared about you and wanted what was best for you in life. 10 seconds of silence. I'll watch the time. Whomever you've been.
So if anybody remembers him, he's a pretty impactful person in the way he talked and how slow and how clear he goes. So I don't know if that sounded really slow to anybody, but that's 120 words per minute. And I also included in there that 10 seconds that he counted at the end, because I'm wondering if for anybody, even that 10 seconds kind of felt like a little bit of a tiny eternity of like, all right, we're waiting here, what's happening? That's only 10 seconds. Some of our students need 30 seconds to up to a minute sometimes to respond. Right? When we talk about wait time, when we talk about allowing our children time to process the information that we give them, possibly at a very fast rate, to really understand what does 10 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute actually look like? And do we ever really give our students that time, that processing time? Because for us, sometimes just sitting there and waiting for a child to respond can feel like an eternity. And Colette said that I'm speaking much more slowly than usual. I've been working on this. And I appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much, Colette. It's tough. It's tough. And so the more nervous you get, the more you get into something, like the faster sometimes you go. So really having to actively think to slow down and process our own words, right? It helps us to process our own words when we can slow down and not work faster than our brain does. But also to not work faster than our students' brains can even process the message we're giving them. So vision loss can also impact a lot of things around visual language. Mirror imaging in ASL. And for those who are not familiar with what mirror imaging is, that is the ability for me to, if I show the sign for home, I sign it on the right side of my face because I'm right-handed. The student who is doing that mirror image would sign that. They wouldn't sign that with their left. If they're dominant, right hand dominant as well, they wouldn't sign that on their face with their left hand, which would typically be the exact opposite of me. They would do the mirror image and sign it on their right side as well. So taking an image and being able to turn it around. It's the same as if we were to draw something in space. If I have a little cutout on the right side of my shape, that person who's receiving that image and duplicating it would need to do it backwards, pretty much. That's mirror imaging. So for our students who have visual processing issues, like CVI, that ability to receive a message and interpret it and turn it around can be significantly impacted. Signs with similar phonemes. And phonemes in ASL are things like the hand shape, the location, and the movement. Some signs have very minor changes in them that mean something different. There are a ton of signs that happen right here. You've got paper and cheese and school and slide and movie. Like there's a ton that have very tiny minor nuances and changes that change the meaning of the word, meaning of the sign. So those little tiny nuances that change could be significantly impacted by vision loss if that child is not able to process those minor differences or see them clearly. Yes, and we've got another person responding about how they appreciate when individuals don't talk fast. Yep, when you have any sort of hearing loss, being able to receive information and process it definitely helps if we're not going so fast. It also then strings our language together, right? The faster you talk, the more it starts to just blend together as opposed to separating our words. And that can mean the difference for our students between, emphasis is also a big thing in that, because there's a minor differences between I scream and ice cream, right? Solely in how we separate or how we emphasize the difference in those. If that is not able to be heard, something like that could be easily misinterpreted. Okay, back to vision. Accessing isolated signs and or strings of language at normal speed. Oh, just what I was saying. Strings of language, right? So strings of spoken language can all start to kind of blend together and sound like one sound. Strings of visual language too. If we start giving our kids just signs and strings of language, are they able to discriminate the different signs and actually what they're seeing? Or even accessing isolated signs. Is it in their right visual field? Is it familiar to them? Can they process all of the parts of language to determine what that sign means? Connecting sign to context. So sometimes we do a lot of transfer of gaze, right? If you're using ASL, a lot of times it is taking in a message from an adult and then comparing it to, say, content in a book or objects or materials on a table. We do literacy activities. Sometimes it's reading a book and then watching a teacher provide information. Or it could be accessing information in a group from multiple people, or the difference between information on a smartboard and a teacher signing. For some of our students, that transfer of gaze can be delayed. If there is issues with their balance, with their vestibular system, sometimes just transferring the gaze takes extra time for them to be able to do that without losing their balance. Or if there are visual processing issues, being able to take in different pieces of visual information, that transfer doesn't happen instantaneously like it does if you have typical vision. And so then students can be missing information or they fatigue faster. And yeah, like we said, following a group conversation in ASL, that requires you to not only have the field access to see that somebody over here is signing and then somebody over there is signing and then it's going around, but also the visual speed to be able to go back and forth between multiple people, to be able to follow a conversation. A student in a classroom might miss a lot of information if a discussion is happening and they can't visually keep up with the pace of it. Incidental learning of new vocabulary, right, from their peers, from seeing a conversation happen between other adults. Deaf children with typical vision pick up on a lot of just incidental information. Seeing other people signing, seeing people sign around them is a way. So our students with vision loss are going to miss out on some of those incidental opportunities. Non-manual signals, like we talked about. So that's facial expressions, a lot of things that happen on the face. Our students with CVI have difficulty looking at faces. Faces are very complex. Also, some of those non-manual signals can be very subtle. And so if you have issues with clarity or issues with visual processing, they could easily be missed. And along the incidental learning line, also what a conversation is. for our students who might not see what a conversation is, meaning watching two other people signing back and forth and having a conversation, just incidentally learning that that's how language happens, that we see other people going back and forth and signing with each other. And a lot of fatigue from using vision for both learning and communication. If it's a struggle, if you're working to kind of process visual information for whatever reason, learning to look. And so that's the same with vision and could be the same with auditory information. If I'm working and if it's work to gain access and to make sense of the information, that fatigue is going to happen so much quicker, especially if I'm using it for both communication as well as trying to learn new content. So when we talk about deaf blindness specifically, it's a disability of access. Why? Because 90% of information is received through our distant senses, our vision and our hearing. 90% of information. So if a student has impact in both and cannot clearly hear or see what's going on around them, what are some things they're going to miss? They're going to miss all those opportunities of learning from their classmates, the conversations like we talked about, but also peer play. How much incidental learning is learned in those early years, early childhood classrooms where kids are doing centers. They're playing in the dress up center, and we're setting up the house, the food and playing dress up or whatever it is, but learning from their classmates through that peer play. They might miss that. They might miss knowing who's with them in the classroom, when people enter, when people leave. So it could be either extremely isolating for that student because they're not sure if anybody is with them or near them for them to even reach out to or try to communicate with, or it could be stressful and chaos. If there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of people around them, but they can't discriminate what these sounds are that they're hearing or what visual images they're taking in to know who's around them or what's happening, it could be a more stressful situation. And content information about the lesson being taught. If we're missing bits and pieces, if I'm getting a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but nothing is a clear picture, then it's going to be difficult to learn new content. So we talk a lot about the term total communication. And so what do we really mean by total communication? And it's pretty much everything listed here and more. The difference is that back in my day, when I initially got into this, total communication was often referred to, at least in deaf and hard of hearing world, as simultaneous communication, meaning that SimCom, we are talking and signing at the same time. That's not really how we're talking about it in this sense, at least, or more exclusively now, it's being referred to as total communication to mean multiple different modalities, but not presented at the same, not simultaneous communication in regards to ASL and spoken language. So it's not exclusively, we're not talking about simultaneous communication. We're talking about total communication. So access to multiple modalities, but not necessarily all thrown at you at once, because some of our students may not be able to access multiple modalities at the same time. Some of our students with CVI cannot look and listen at the same time. They can't handle auditory and visual information at the same time, or even visual and tactile information at the same time. So we often have to layer those pieces of sensory information. We need to isolate them and provide visual information and then another modality, whatever that might be, or visual modality and AAC separately. So we're giving them all of these tools, just maybe not necessarily all at once. But it includes, so in ASL wise, as part of total communication, we've got visual or tactile. Tactile seems to be the more scary version for everybody. And I don't know why. Is it just that it's kind of more unknown, that it's a little unfamiliar? We don't really do it a lot. We're not really, as teachers of the deaf, that's not really something that comes into our training, right? So it's not something that we really learn how to do or how it's accessed. So maybe that makes it a little bit more of not the thing that we go to right away. But we want to keep in mind it exists. Tactile ASL is a thing. So for our students who are struggling to pick up visual ASL, or they might be getting little pieces here and there, but their language is not really developing any further, we kind of hit a wall, or we've just got, very few simple signs and really not, struggling with where to go. We often look at a lot of the AAC options that we have available to us, and there's nothing wrong with that, but keeping in the back of your mind, tactile ASL is a thing, and still an opportunity to give our students a full and complete language that's also accessible to them at all times, because we like using spoken language or ASL because they're with a child all of the time, as opposed to needing a device or something else that we have to have, carry with them for AAC. But thinking, remembering that tactile ASL, there's a full and complete language and philosophy around it, and getting into pro-tactile is a whole separate webinar and discussion. But just knowing that it is there and keeping it in your toolbox as something to consider for your students who are deaf or hard of hearing that might need access to ASL but are struggling to access it visually. And this is just another funny thing that I stole from Chris Russell. This is his favorite picture, that multisensory overstimulation is observable if we're watching, and just recognizing when our students might be overstimulated if we are trying to provide them with a lot of stimulation at one time, or if we're not aware that maybe the environment is too complex or the information is too complex. So just being cognizant of that. So where do we start with trying to support our students with their communication? Hopefully everybody on here is familiar with the communication matrix. It is definitely our go-to as a great tool for assessing a student's expressive communication, no matter what modality they use, no matter what level they are at, because it goes back to the most basic foundational skills. There are 7 levels to it, and it starts at the most basic level of even just those instinctual, infantile, reactionary behaviors. So if anybody has a student that they are struggling to determine maybe what their student is expressing and how they are doing it, the communication matrix is a great tool. And it also can help you kind of determine where a student's at and where they need to build to. What are the next things we need to do? Give you some ideas for writing some goals and planning on a way to increase their communication. Interpreter switch. Okay, and just for an FYI, if anybody is interested, this poster is from the New York DeafBlind Project. I can get you a copy of this in a more visually accessible format. But it was just a way to take and kind of break down the levels of the communication matrix. And I wanted you guys to see that really concrete symbols is that bridge from those early communication behaviors, those pre-linguistic levels, to our first words and language. So while all children go through all of these levels in typical development, and even often stop at concrete symbols, because, right, children sometimes will hand you something as a way that they, when they want something, they might hand it to their parent, or pick something up and show them if they don't understand their verbal approximation. So all children go through these stages, but a lot of times our children with complex communication needs kind of gets stuck at this level. So just being aware that this is a means to an end. And a lot of times our children with complex communication needs or deaf blindness stay at this level a lot longer. They need to build from this level for a lot more time than a typically developing child. But it is, again, an attempt for it to be a means to an end and not the end place where we want our students to end up. We want them to use this as a bridge to hopefully get to abstract language. And so just some other assessment tools, if people are interested in some other assessment options for deaf and hard of hearing students with emergent language. There are a variety of tools and resources out there. This first one, the MacArthur, is just a checklist, like a vocabulary list of those initial words and gestures that typically developing students use. This is a normed assessment and gives you an idea of just ways to start with vocabulary and documenting children's vocabulary receptively and or expressively. And then there's the VCSL is a great sign language checklist for those emerging skills in ASL and even those pre-linguistic skills that sometimes we will see our deaf and hard of hearing students start to pick up on if they have sufficient access to language. So just some things to think about if you guys are trying to search for other assessment options as students start to begin to develop some abstract language. So how do we build a foundation of communication in our children with deaf blindness? Really, it's those shared experiences. It's that being present, that hands-on, the active listener. And for those of us who are hearing and sighted, an active listener is somebody who might be visually engaging or showing that they are actively listening. But for our students who are deafblind, it might need to take that more active role in having some physical contact student, being in, having touch, join through hand under hand. So you guys are using hand under hand to explore something together. So being an active listener for our students with deafblindness sometimes takes on a more physical, a more full body role than just simply being present in the space with the child. Providing a robust receptive language model. And again, that the key term is in an accessible modality, and working to determine what is an accessible modality for your students. And using that multimodal approach, because for some students, they might have both auditory and visual access, but it might not be complete. So they might need support using a multimodal approach for either for receptive information or for how they are able to express, right? As we talked about, some of our students might be able to receptively understand spoken language, but if they are not able to express in the modality, we need to teach them a different modality to allow them to also be able to expressively communicate, because we want both, right? We don't just want our kids to be able to listen to us, but we want them also to be able to communicate themselves. And modeling that child's expressive modality. We need to model what they are using, which could be a formal language modality or could be more pre-linguistic, right? If our students are using some gestures, some intentional behaviors, modeling those for the student as well. What we currently see them using as ways to engage with them. So that could be, simple, I had a little guy who was pretty physically limited in his movement, but he could stick out his tongue. And so when he would stick out his tongue, other people thought it was cute and they would stick out their tongue back. And then it was a turn-taking game and it was a way to communicate. And so he would use that as a way to initiate with other people, initiate engagement. So even modeling that for him too, we eventually try to build and scaffold to more appropriate means of initiating communication. But while children are learning to find what physically is capable for them to use to express something, we need to join them on their level and help model and express their expressive modalities to encourage them to want to communicate more often and more frequently. And just responding to our children's communicative intents. We can't always give them everything that they want, everything that they ask for, right? But as they're learning and building language, we at least want to make sure that every time that we see our children intending to communicate something to us, that we were responsive to them, and we engage with them and give them some sort of feedback to say, even, sorry, I see that you are telling me you want to be finished with this activity, but we've got 5 more minutes or whatever it is, so that they continue to have motivation to increase that depth and breadth of how they communicate. Managing behavior. So just some things to think about that always keeping in the back of your mind: language and communication, especially for our students with deaf blindness, making sure that we determine, is that behavior, or could that behavior possibly be the result of a misunderstanding or miscommunication, before we say that, yes, it's definitely a behavior that is being used for a refusal or an attention gaining or whatever it might be. Really making sure, is it possibly that the child is not visually processing language, or not visually able to, is not receiving the message we're giving them, or does not have the communication to express to us what's going on, and so they're using that behavior as the only way that they can communicate something to us, for us to actually go, oh, something's wrong. Utilize multiple modalities to provide information on what is expected or what is not permitted, right? So again, it's going back to making sure our message is received. So maybe not just using spoken language or just using signs, but also making sure you have some visuals or some materials, some tactile materials, multiple ways to provide information to that student on what is expected for them to do. Walking our students through it, going through an action, teaching them exactly what they are supposed to do or not supposed to do, as opposed to just providing them with information, actively getting up and doing something, using everything in our toolbox to truly provide information. Adjusting expectations in the moment to achieve the desired goal. For our students that are learning to use expressive language, that are limited communicators, thinking in that moment, what is my goal? Is my goal for them to complete this entire meal and eat everything on their plate? Or is my goal that they are using communication and letting me know that they are all done without having a temper tantrum or a meltdown? What is my expectation in that moment? What is my goal? Is my goal some communication, so I'm going to reinforce that? Or is my goal that they complete the task that I initially set out for them? So just adjusting, constantly thinking about, adjusting our expectations in the moment of what we are trying to achieve, so that we get the best out of every teaching moment. Exposure to language versus understanding, right? Thinking again, when we're talking about strings of language, we don't want to limit what we provide to our students. We don't want to limit what we expose them to. They should have exposure to full and complete language. But knowing exposure versus making sure that our message is received and understood might need some tweaking to highlight key vocabulary, to repeat keywords, to isolate those key signs or those keywords that we want that student to receive and possibly reproduce. So just kind of balancing how we present language to our students. And then, of course, celebrating even the small victories, right? We all need the opportunity, especially now, to just even the littlest things to celebrate, not only for your students, but also for yourselves as teachers. looking back at where a child has come from day 1 to day 55, and you're like, they've made 2 steps, or we've done, we have little things that we've seen of little progress. That's progress. Progress is still progress. And so celebrate for them the little things, but also celebrate for yourselves as teachers, as parents, of those little victories. They count and they're meaningful, and they're going to help us get through today and tomorrow, and wanting to keep going and keep moving forward. Good. No, I skipped one. But we're just talking briefly about hand under hand. I know I have way more stuff in here than we would ever get to in one day. But hopefully a lot of this stuff that we're going through at the moment is some more familiar to you all from some other webinars, or it's in other webinars if it's not. But hand under hand, of course, is the approach we want to take. Hand under hand and not hand over hand. And quick little video to show you how hand under hand can be really successful.
All right, so let's try again. Help me. Oh. Help me one more time. Oh, good job. Can we pull it apart, TT? Come on, give me your hand. Put your thumb in the middle and look. Whoa. All right, I'm going to put that inside the great bag. Look, there's little sections, TT. Come on, Killers, help me. Help me. We're going to take one, okay? And we're going to examine it. Let's do it.
So this mom is a great example of utilizing hand under hand. And this is that was this child who before was very new to food, to real food, and to exploring different foods and different textures. This was something we were really working on. And so she was really resistant to touching anything on her own. So when mom incorporated hand under hand, now not only is she's engaged in the activity, but actually after that, mom was able to progress her to mom was able to back her own hand out, and the child was able to actually independently engage with the orange herself. So it was just a really good example of how hand under hand can help build some of these skills for our students, and how utilizing that when it kind of might look like the adult is doing more, that is way more engaging, actively engaging with the student than in any way trying to use hand over hand to have them physically do something. Intervener should hopefully be a familiar word to you all. If it's not, reach out to your local DeafBlind project. But these are our trusted individuals who help work with the student with deaf blindness across all environments to facilitate all interactions, communication, social skills, all of that stuff. Structuring the learning environment, right? We know this stuff. Having that daily routine, that calendar system, having activities have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And for our students with deaf blindness, we talk about providing what we call cognitive closure, which means that, determining how something has a beginning, a middle, and an end, providing that full understanding to them that things have an end and where they go. If, if the child with deaf blindness is, say, playing with a puzzle and they are stopped in the middle of that because it's time to go to lunch, and so they leave that there, and another adult comes along after them and cleans up that puzzle, that adult might just simply clean it up and put it on a shelf over in a center or something like that. But if that student with deaf blindness does not have that visual access to know that this thing went to there, that could create a huge meltdown. They come back and they have no idea what happened, where that puzzle went, what happened. So providing that cognitive closure to show children that, it's that also that object permanence of this thing didn't just disappear we cleaned it up and moved it right over here. It's you know, maybe 2 feet away from you, and you can still use it again, or you can use it next time. So just providing that cognitive closure for them, that of how things come to being, how things exist, how they get from one point to point A to point B. Food doesn't just magically show up on a spoon in front of them, right? They have to make it. There's a whole process in the beginning, and there's a whole process in the end. And introducing yourself to the child every time you begin an interaction. We talk about the tactile cues, ways for you to tactily introduce yourself to a child, but also pairing that with something that they can do, with a name, with a verbal name, a sign name, something, a way, you know, an object that you can leave with them so that that child can address you too, can ask for you. Does that child have a way to ask for you when you're not present, if you're the therapist or the parent or whatever it might be? Our students need to be able to have names for us, ways that they can address us and know who we are, but also ways that they can communicate for themselves to ask for us, because we hope that they like us and want to see us again. Touch cues, we talk about a lot in just a way to provide tactile information to a student about what's going to happen. Some quick examples of just ways, you know, to provide a child with information about what's going to happen and things that are going to enter their space. Name cues, like we talked about. So it's a tactile representation of somebody, a way to recognize their teacher if they see them at school or out in the community on an event, out in the sunlight if don't have great visual access. Just another way to identify yourself. Tangible symbols, which we talk about all the time, and calendar systems. And again, if anybody has any questions on any of these, there are other webinars linked to our website that go into this stuff in way more detail. And hopefully for a lot of you guys, this is some repeat information that you know. And then just thinking that even photos can be visually or conceptually complex, right? We talk about, you know, we think of photos as a very concrete form. When we move from objects, we go from objects to photos. And so photos should be a more concrete, that like next step in being a concrete representation of something. Not always if you don't know what it's representing. And if anybody can figure out what this is, apparently this is a spider eating a giant cockroach. And apparently these exist in Hawaii. So if anybody is wishing that they lived in Hawaii right now, maybe not, because this is what you'd get. But just remembering that even photos can be visually complex if we don't know if we don't have prior experience or exposure to what the photo was representing. Which follows along the lines of symbolism. We talk about symbolism a lot. I wanted to kind of get to core vocabulary real quickly. So that's why I was flipping through this, unless if anybody has any questions. When we talk about when we're choosing items for our objects or our photos, just remembering symbolism and iconicity. What is that child's experience with that item, so that we make sure that we are picking the correct object or the correct photo or the correct symbol that's going to help them to understand what we're referring to. And then incorporating some core vocabulary. So just keeping in mind how abstract core vocabulary can be sometimes. And I don't, you know, when we're looking at these symbols that come with a lot of our core boards, how easy is it to recognize what these things represent if we did not have the printed words on there, or the prior experience with these objects, these actions, these symbols that they're representing? For anybody who hasn't already memorized the boards, if you look at the, you know, the center thing where I crossed out the print, would anybody really know what that's representing? I mean, it could be top and corner, it could be big and little, it could be, it's actually it and that. are the two words that these these symbols are supposed to represent. But anything with an arrow, conceptually, the child has to know that there's a thing, what the thing is, and what an arrow represents, that an arrow is pointing to something, or an arrow could mean movement or action. So there's a lot of complex things happening here that our students have to know in order to be able to apply that language or apply those skills to interpreting what these symbols mean. The ones that include signs, signs are 3D language. So the picture you see on the one with the U, they've got to know that that's a 2D representation of a 3D form of a finger that's coming at you. And so for our kids with CVI who have difficulties processing visual information, are they going to clearly catch that of what that, and that's not like just a cranked finger? And any of our signs that have movement, the more the finished, do they understand that arrows or things can represent that movement within the sign? Yeah. And so along these lines too, I will share with you that there is an article, and I am happy to share this article with you all. On these authors kind of looked at core vocabulary lists, English is hard, for young children and considerations for early language development. And what it really gets into is that typically developing children don't typically start with core vocabulary, because core vocabulary, the purpose of it is to have these high frequency words from the English language, right? These words that we can use frequently for a lot of different purposes to help increase a child's expressive language opportunities. But if our students maybe don't have that receptive language foundation, so our deaf and hard of hearing students who have not heard people model the multiple ways that these words can be used across environments, are they going to be able to recognize the different ways in which that word can be used as an expressive means for something, right? Because first, how do we build our first initial vocabulary? We pair a word, a sign, a spoken word, whatever it is, with typically something concrete, a person, an object, or an action, something that we can experience, fully experience. And so if we're working on building those most foundational vocabulary, do our students know when a label is something that represents one thing, or it's a descriptor that represents lots of things that we can use in lots of different ways? So this article kind of goes more in depth into that. Oh, I was checking the chat box, sorry guys. And they also did, if I can get to it real quick for you all, a poster session for ASHA in 2018, and kind of highlighted that when we typically choose the early words, when we're typically picking early vocabulary for students, or typically developing children, their early vocabulary stems from, it typically reflects an individual's interests, experiences, and routines. It typically represents the people, objects, and actions and events that are most salient and motivating to the individual, right? Typically, kids express the things that are most motivating to them and present to them at that youngest age. And it cannot be predicted simply based on which words children hear most often. Rather, children produce the words that they want to use. So when we're choosing that initial vocabulary that we want our most emerging communicators to start using in whatever modality, doing that likes preference assessment, determining what is motivating this child. What is this child going to want to communicate about? Because they are never going to want to communicate something that we want them to communicate about if we are never giving them a way to communicate what they actually want to achieve or gain or desire. So I am more than happy to share any of these documents with you all if you want to read through them further. And I think I'm going to kind of leave it there because we've got about 4 minutes left. I need everybody to do the evaluation for me, please, if possible. If you click on the link and complete the very quick evaluation, they will provide you with a certificate at the end as soon as you complete it. And it will very much help us for our project, as well as just helping us to prepare for next time of, you know, tweaking information or what works and doesn't work. So please fill that out if anybody has any additional questions. And yeah, everybody who's registered, we have your email addresses, so Sherry can send out the PowerPoint, as well as I will happily share all of those documents with you guys. Cool, thank you all. Thank you guys. If anybody has wants additional information, I will plug, if you know Sandy Newcomb, her and there's an SLP that she's working with are currently doing a podcast and going to create a program on AAC and CBI. The world of CBI and AAC combined is really kind of exploding. So there's a lot of learning opportunities in that area for you. So just start Googling